They say you always remember your first love the way they made you feel, the moments you shared. But what if your first love wasn't quite human? What if the memories that haunt you aren't just about love, but about fear? This is tonight's story, a tale of beauty, danger, and the shadows that never truly let you go. If you enjoy stories that linger in your mind and make you question what's real, don't forget to like and subscribe for more whispers in the dark. I still remember the moment Greg's father pulled up outside my house, the low rumble of the car echoing off the cracked pavement. It was 2009, the summer holidays, and I was 16th and armed, big-footed, and sporting a shaggy mess of hair that annoyed my mum to no end. In truth, I was grateful for any excuse to escape the stale air of home, but I never imagined I'd be leaving for a place like Galloway Forest. I'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks. The Lawsons had invited me along, promising camping, fresh air, and a proper break from the mundane monotony of my small-town life. I'd known Greg since we were kids thrown together by Sunday school and the awkwardness of adolescence. We both sat in the back pew each week, sharing half-concealed jokes during sermons we didn't quite understand. He was tall for his age, already overshadowing me by a good head, with a mop of sandy hair that made him look perpetually windswept. We used to climb trees after church, or else we'd hide out in the church hall's musty basement, spinning elaborate theories about ghosts and hidden passages. That's just who we were. Two scrawny boys in a world too small to contain our imaginations. His parents were a curious pair. Mr. Lawson Bryan always reminded me of a storybook giant, barrel-chested, broad-shouldered, his laughter echoing in every room he entered. He was the sort of father who clapped you on the back so hard your teeth rattled and boomed your name before thrusting a plate of biscuits under your nose. A devout churchgoer, to be sure, but never preachy. He simply had that sincerity about him, the unwavering conviction that God intended families to be loud, loving, and occasionally chaotic. Mrs. Lawson, by contrast, was quiet but vigilant. She had this way of observing a room without saying much, as though every flicker of movement was a secret she carefully catalogued. I'd seen her hush her husband with a mere touch on his arm, a tiny gesture that could shift the entire atmosphere. While Greg had inherited his father's height, he'd inherited his mother's watchful Isa pale gray that seemed to miss nothing. The plan had been simple enough. Greg, me, and Mr. and Mrs. Lawson would head for Galloway Forest in the family car. 3 hours drive, maybe 4 if the roads were clogged with tourists or the weather turned sour. We'd camp for a long weekend, roasting marshmallows and scaring ourselves silly with ghost stories. My dad, with whom I had a stilted relationship at best, had simply shrugged when I'd asked permission. "Fresh air," he said, as though that alone was enough to recommend it. If I'm honest, I didn't care what he thought, I just wanted out. So, there I was, perched on my doorstep, backpack in one hand, sleeping bag under the other arm, waiting for Greg and his folks to arrive. The sun beamed down, though the breeze still carried a hint of Scottish chill. When the blue Ford Estate finally pulled up, it felt like a getaway car rescuing me from a prison sentence. "Ready, kiddo?" Mr. Lawson asked, leaning out of the driver's window with an enormous grin. I grinned back. "Been ready forever." He hopped out, took my backpack, and threw it into the car's boot. Greg, already in the back seat, fiddled with an old cassette player. "Shotgun's free," he said, wiggling his eyebrows in invitation. But I just shrugged and slid in beside him. "Mrs. Lawson offered a quiet nod of greeting from the front passenger seat, her hair tied back in a tight ponytail. In that moment, I couldn't imagine any scenario where I'd regret coming along. The car rattled away from my house, my father visible through the rear window, barely lifting a hand in farewell. I realized I was holding my breath until we turned the corner. Then, The tension seeped out of me, replaced by a cautious excitement. Got everything? Greg asked. As far as I know, I said, patting the bulging pockets of my coat. Snacks, water, and an extra pair of socks, just in case. Greg snorted. Always the Boy Scout. Mr. Lawson revved the car onto the main road, the tires humming against tarmac. We settled into a comfortable silence, the only soundtrack the crackle of the cassette player, spitting out an assortment of rock ballads from the 90s. Occasionally, Mrs. Lawson would turn her head to glance at us, but she never spoke unless she had something important to say. It wasn't long before we left behind the rows of modest council houses and the battered gray shops that defined my small town. Urban landscape gave way to sprawling fields, green and gold under the early afternoon sun. Tractor tracks scarred the earth here and there, and the odd cow or sheep would look up as we sped by, unimpressed. Mr. Lawson adjusted the rearview mirror. So, you boys ready for some real wilderness? Greg rolled his eyes. It's not exactly the Congo, Dad. It's just a forest. A forest steeped in old magic, Mrs. Lawson murmured, almost to herself. That caught my attention. Old magic? I echoed. Mr. Lawson let out a short laugh. Don't fill their heads with nonsense, love. Mrs. Lawson shrugged, unruffled. You can call it nonsense, but it's older than any of us. She turned slightly in her seat so she could meet my gaze. Have you heard the legends, Sam? I shook my head. Not really. I mean, I've heard people say Galloway's big and dark, but nothing more than that. Her lips curved into a faint smile, as if she was about to share something that both fascinated and unsettled her. It's part of ancient Scotland, Unaland, that belonged to the first tribes, before there were towns or roads. They said the forest housed more than just animals. The Fae, the Sith, the fairies, whatever you like to call them. Some stories say they're mischievous, leading travelers astray with dancing lights. Others say they're malevolent, bloodthirsty, even. Greg made a mock spooky face at me, waggling his fingers. Ooh, bloodthirsty fairies. Grow up, I muttered, shoving his shoulder in jest, but a tingle ran through me. Mrs. Lawson's tone was so matter-of-fact, it felt like she believed every word. And not just fairies, Mrs. Lawson went on, eyes flicking to the countryside rushing past. There are tales of creatures far worse. The Boaban Sith, for instance. She pronounced it in that soft Gaelic whisper Banshee. A female spirit, said to roam the glens at night in the shape of a beautiful woman, luring wandering men to their doom. Core, Greg said, raising an eyebrow. That's quite a bedtime story. Mr. Lawson huffed. All a load of old wives' tales, if you ask me. Mrs. Lawson offered him a gentle smile, but there was a hint of reproach in her gaze. Scotland has old bones, she said, and old bones come with old stories. Something about her words made me shiver. I adjusted the seatbelt as the car rumbled over a slight pothole, momentarily jostling us. Outside, the rolling fields were giving way to low hills blanketed in thick grass. The smell of wild gorse permeated the air whenever we cracked open the windows. It felt like we were heading into another world, leaving behind everything familiar. Time blurred as Mr. Lawson kept the car steady on the winding roads, each turn revealing more dramatic vistas, a glimmering stream, a slope of heather, or a flock of sheep perched on a hillside. Occasionally, we passed a battered sign pointing toward places with names I couldn't pronounce. Baltersan, Colzian, Carnock Point. Part of me wondered if those areas were full of the same ancient hush that seemed to await us in Galloway. We stopped once at a small service station to stretch our legs and grab a snack. The station was little more than a glorified hut and a pair of grimy petrol pumps. Mr. Lawson filled the tank while Mrs. Lawson disappeared inside to buy bottled water. Greg and I stood by the car, munching on sandwiches we'd brought from home, scanning the horizon. The sky was still bright, but grey clouds now hovered in the distance, like a warning of sudden Scottish rain. You think your mum actually believes that stuff about the fairies? I asked quietly, stepping closer so Mr. Lawson wouldn't overhear. Greg shrugged, halfway through a mouthful of cheese sandwich. She's always been a bit connected, you know? Reads a lot of folklore and weird history. Dad says it's just her hobby. I nodded, though a knot of unease twisted in my stomach. Still, it's interesting, isn't it? Interesting, maybe. Kinda weird, definitely. He paused, licking a crumb from his lip. But you know, I don't mind. At least it's something different from the usual routine. I smiled at that, because I knew exactly what he meant. Anything was better than the oppressive dullness of daily life in our neighborhood. If Galloway Forest had even a scrap of mystery, it would be worth the journey. When we got back on the road, the scenery began to change. The fields gradually melted into thicker clusters of pine and fir, their emerald boughs weaving a canopy overhead as we ventured deeper. Our phone signals dropped to single bars, then vanished altogether. Greg frowned at his phone before tossing it aside in frustration. Useless in these parts, mister, Lawson said matter-of-factly, catching sight of Greg's expression in the mirror. That's one reason people love it, no distractions, just good old nature. Mrs. Lawson's eyes drifted across the canopy as we sped along. And old legends, she murmured again. So quietly, I almost missed it. I watched the shapes of the trees blur by, their trunks knotted and gnarled, like the twisted limbs of arthritic giants. A gloom seemed to settle around us, an undercurrent of something not quite tangible. The sunlight grew thinner, replaced by mottled shadows dancing across the windscreen. Greg's cassette player sputtered and died halfway through a track. He ejected the tape, peering at it as though it had personally offended him. Weird, he said. I changed the batteries before we left. Silly device, Mr. Lawson said, taking his eyes off the road for just a moment. Must be knackered. We said little else for the remainder of the drive. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. Exactly, it was more that an invisible hand pressed down upon us, like the hush before a thunderstorm. My gaze kept drifting back to Mrs. Lawson. She was quiet, hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. Whenever Mr. Lawson tried to lighten the mood with a joke or comment on the scenery, she'd just nod or offer a soft chuckle that never reached her eyes. At last, we spotted the rough wooden sign that read Galloway Forest Park, half choked by ivy and leaning precariously. The road narrowed and the trees pressed in, forming a corridor of green. We turned a sharp bend, and for an instant, I could have sworn I saw movement in the undergrowth, a flash of white or pale gray. Maybe a deer, perhaps just the swirl of a plastic bag. It was gone almost as soon as it appeared. Home sweet home for the weekend, Mr. Lawson proclaimed. The path opened onto a gravel lay-by, and he pulled over, cutting the engine. The hush of the forest swallowed us immediately, thicker and deeper than any quiet I'd known. My ears rang with it. The pine-scented air felt older, heavier, carrying the promise of secrets best left undisturbed. Greg turned to me, excitement dancing behind his eyes, though a hint of nerves quivered in his smile. We're really here? I nodded, my heart beating a little too fast. In the distance, the trees towered like ancient sentinels, their dark silhouettes flickering in the shifting sunlight. An undercurrent of something primal and mysterious pulsed through the woodland, as though the place breathed with its own life. Mrs. Lawson opened her door and stepped out, inhaling deeply. You can almost feel it, she whispered, more to herself than to any of us. Feel what? I asked, unable to quell my curiosity. She turned back, her gray eyes momentarily reflecting the gloom of the forest. Scotland's old bones, she said. The land of the first creatures, the Sith, The fairies. You can feel them, can't you? A shiver ran through me, a sensation both thrilling and disconcerting. I couldn't deny there was something in the air, an electric charge, or a silent watcher in the bow. Whether it was the stuff of folklore or just my imagination, I wasn't sure. Greg shoved open his door, clambering out with a grin. Mr. Lawson followed, stretching his arms and rolling his shoulders. I finally unclicked my seatbelt and pushed the door open, stepping onto the gravel. A sudden wave of cool air brushed across my face. As I lifted my eyes to the ancient, towering pines, I realized how small we were in comparison, how easily this place could swallow us. And for the first time, I felt a sliver of apprehension slip beneath my excitement. We were here, in this land whispered about in old Gaelic myths, a place that had seen centuries pass in silence. I told myself it was just a forested collection of trees and trails. Yet deep down, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, Mrs. Lawson was right. Perhaps the forest harbored forces far older and darker than we cared to admit. I took a breath and forced a smile, because the adventure had only just begun. The car crunched along a gravel track leading deeper into Galloway Forest, the afternoon sun drifting overhead with a languid, golden warmth. We'd pulled away from the official entrance area, modest lot, lined with signposts, and a small visitor center, and now rumbled over a winding lane just wide enough for our vehicle. I couldn't help but notice Mr. Lawson's growing scowl as the track dipped and rose. It was as if every bend reminded him of something he didn't much care for. Eventually, the trees receded, revealing a public campsite. A wide clearing sprawled out, hemmed by bright signboards and wooden fences. Colored flags fluttered overhead, signifying designated spots, while a handful of other families were already pitched with their modern pop-up tents. Laughter and chatter drifted on the breeze, and I caught the scent of charred sausages from someone's portable barbecue. To me, it looked like a perfect place to set up and relax, but Mr. Lawson slowed the car to a halt and let out a low, dissatisfied grunt. "This is too commercial," he said, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. "Feels more like a festival than proper camping." Greg leaned forward from the back seat, peering out the window. "They've even got toilets over there, Dad, and a tiny kiosk selling ice cream." "Exactly my point," Mr. Lawson grumbled. "We came here for some real nature, not a convenience store in a forest." Mrs. Lawson turned in her seat, her brow creased. "Brian, you knew there was a public site. I thought that was the plan." He sighed. Yeah, we can do better." His gaze swept across the clearing, then lingered on the towering line of pines that continued deeper into the woods. "We can hike in a ways, 5 miles. Really, get some peace." In the back seat, Greg shot me a look, half amused and half relieved. We'd shared a mild worry that his dad might choose something even more remote. But 5 miles wasn't too extreme. And though a part of me liked the idea of hot showers and a kiosk for snacks, there was a thrill in the promise of a more authentic wilderness experience. "All right," Mrs. Lawson relented, "but let's at least leave the car here safely. They've got an attendant who watches the vehicles." She squinted out the front windshield. "We'll just have to lug our gear." Mr. Lawson nodded. "Better to keep the car where people can keep an eye on it. Come on then, let's get moving before the sun falls." He killed the engine, and we all piled out onto the soft gravel. A breeze laced with pine and smoke from someone's barbecue brushed my face. I couldn't deny the campsite did look cheerful. Children were running around waving sticks, and an older couple lounged by a small fire pit. But Mr. Lawson wasn't one for half measures. If he said we were going to hike, we were going to hike. With no reason to argue and a growing sense of excitement at the potential for real adventure, I hefted my backpack onto my shoulder. Each of us did a quick inventory. Tents, sleeping bags, cooking utensils, some canned food, plus a few awkwardly sized extras. Mr. Lawson insisted on bringing a folding spade, water containers, lantern fuel, Greg stuffed a spare flannel shirt into his bulging pack while cursing under his breath about the weight. Miss Lawson slipped a small map out of the side pocket of her bag, tracing a faint route with her fingertip before handing it to Mr. Lawson. "You sure about this path?" she asked softly. "It's labeled moderate difficulty." "Moderate is fine," Mr. Lawson replied with a grin, adjusting his broad shoulders as he strapped on his pack. "We're fit enough, aren't we?" Greg and I exchanged a conspiratorial eye roll and fell into step behind him. Mrs. Lawson took the lead initially, guiding us down a rough-hewn trail that skirted around the official camping area. Beyond the fence was a sign that read Wildlife Conservation Zone, enter at own risk. I felt a small prickle of nerves reading that, but it was probably just a legal precaution. We stepped through a gate of weathered wood, letting it swing closed behind us. At once, the atmosphere changed. The hum of campsite activity dropped away, replaced by the sighing hush of wind in the upper branches. Birds twittered nearby, unseen among the leaves. The forest floor was soft and springy, blanketed with moss and layers of old pine needles that muffled our footstep. Sunlight fell in dappled patches, giving the place a dreamy, flickering quality, as though we were passing through a living tapestry. Mr. Lawson's voice carried lightly through the trees. "Right. The map shows a stream about 5 miles in. I'm thinking we find that, look for a good clearing, and set up camp." I nodded. Not that he could see me. There was something deeply soothing about the forest, the way it seemed to breathe around us. Even Greg looked uncharacteristically peaceful, though from time to time he fiddled with his phone, likely to see if there was the faintest bar of signal. Nothing, it seemed. The first mile or so was easy walking. We followed a winding trail wide enough for two to walk abreast, occasionally spotting older signposts pointing to marked viewpoints or disused logging roads. The scents of damp earth and pine resin were overwhelming at times, but refreshing compared to the stale reek of car exhaust I was used to back home. Thick ferns lined the path, arching their fronds to brush against our shin. About halfway through, we paused for water. Mrs. Lawson studied the map again, eyebrows raised in a mixture of satisfaction and caution. "We're on the right track, though it's a bit steeper ahead. Maybe we'll reach the stream in another hour." Greg grinned, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "At least we haven't run into that bloodthirsty fairy of yours." She shot him a look. "It's not mine, it's just an old legend." But a small smile tugged at her lip. "Mr. Lawson took a deep swig from his canteen, then passed it to me. "We'll see about legends," he said, looking around as though half expecting a mischievous sprite to pop out from behind a tree. "In the meantime, let's crack on, shall we?" We pressed on, stepping over fallen logs and scattered roots. The sun sank lower, casting the forest in a warmer, more golden light that made everything glow. I heard the faint rush of water before I spotted the stream. A gentle murmuring like distant conversation. It was a small thing, tumbling over rocks in a lazy current, but it seemed pure and clear. The trail dipped into a small hollow where the ground flattened out into a grassy clearing perhaps 20 or 30 yards across. A few large stones sat at the edges, tangled with moss, and slender saplings ringed the perimeter. The stream itself snaked past the northern edge, its bank sturdy enough for kneeling or refilling canteens. My first thought was how picturesque it looked, like something out of a travel brochure, minus the crowd. Mrs. Lawson paused at the clearing's entrance, taking a slow, appraising breath. "This," she announced, "is perfect. There's space for tents, access to fresh water, and enough trees around for a bit of shelter if the weather turns." He rubbed his chin, then nodded with a grin. I like it. Wild enough to feel remote, but not so dense we can't see the sky." Greg and I deposited our packs near a soft patch of grass. At that moment, the sense of accomplishment made the site feel like our own private kingdom, secreted away from the rest of the world. I glanced around, noticing how the sunlight slanted through the tree trunks, illuminating drifting motes of dust. It struck me that we must be at least a couple of miles past the last marked trail. Out here, we were truly alone. "All right," Mr. Lawson boomed, clapping his hands. "Let's get these tents up before nightfall. Greg, you help Sam with the smaller tent. I'll sort ours." He nodded toward Mrs. Lawson, who reached into her pack for collapsible tent poles. There was an eager energy in the air as we got to work. Greg laid out the ground sheet while I unzipped the canvas. We chatted about trivial things: music, a girl he fancied back home, what old man Wilcox from church would say if he saw us camping in the middle of nowhere. Our laughter bounced off the trees, surprisingly loud. At one point, Greg's phone dropped from his pocket, and when he bent to pick it up, he cursed under his breath. "My battery's at, like, 15%, he muttered. It was 50 when we left the car. I shrugged, tapping my own phone's screen. Mine's about the same, actually. Greg scrunched his nose. Weird, huh? We let it go. Maybe the constant searching for signal was draining them, but it added a strange note to the otherwise light atmosphere. I tossed the phone back into my bag, figuring I wouldn't need it here anyway. As we pitched the tents, the faint hush of the stream never left my ears. Its gentle rush provided a calming backdrop, reminding me that nature had its own steady rhythm. It took us maybe 30 minutes to get both tents secure. Mr. Lawson hammered the last peg for his and Mrs. Lawson's tent, wiping sweat from his brow and exhaling with satisfaction. "There," he said. "Now, that's a proper setup." Mrs. Lawson agreed, surveying the area with a pleased smile. "Let's gather some firewood before it gets dark. Then we can relax properly." Soon, we had a small pile of branches and kindling. Mr. Lawson assembled a ring of stones for a makeshift fire pit near the stream. Greg and I took turns snapping thicker branches over our knees. A few needed Mr. Lawson's burly arms to break. As the sun dipped even lower, the clearing was suffused with orange and pink light. Through the tall pines, I glimpsed the sky turning pale lavender, a transition from day into evening that felt both peaceful and subtly foreboding, as if the forest might change character once the light was gone. We cooked dinner over the fire, balancing a tiny pot on a metal grate Mr. Lawson had packed. The meal was simpleton stew, crusty bread, and a few stray biscuits for dessert, but it tasted divine in the cool, fresh air. We ate hungrily, passing a flask of hot tea around. Warmth spread through me as I sipped, watching the flames flicker. Occasionally, a gust of wind set the leaves rustling in a way that sounded eerily like hushed voices, but I reasoned it was just my imagination. Greg seemed relaxed, joking about how we might start an annual tradition. The Great Lawson Camping Excursion, teaching unsuspecting city kids how to rough it, only half feigning offense. We were all from the same small town, but Greg liked to act as though I'd been raised in some sprawling urban jungle. Mr. Lawson eventually stretched out, leaning on his elbows while gazing up at the sky. "It's fun, though," he murmured, "getting away from the madness." Mrs. Lawson nodded. I can almost feel the tension leaving my shoulders. To an outside observer, it must have seemed picture perfect. A family and me, an honorary tag-along sitting around a crackling campfire, open sky above. No distractions besides each other's conversation and nature's gentle lullaby. And to be fair, it was. Yet, every so often, a small prickle of awareness nagged at me. The wind would shift, or a branch would snap in the undergrowth, and I'd catch myself checking the darkening tree line. Nothing was ever there, just the silhouettes of swaying branches, the scattered dance of shadows. Still, the feeling that we weren't entirely alone lingered at the edge of my thoughts. After dinner, Mrs. Lawson rummaged for a torch. "I'll just nip down to the stream to rinse these bowls," she said, picking them up. "Anyone want to come? It's getting dark." "I'll go," Greg offered, stretching to his feet. Might as well brush my teeth while I'm there. They wandered toward the water's edge, torchlight bobbing in the dusk. Mr. Lawson and I stayed by the fire, feeding it another branch and settling into a comfortable quiet. His gaze was fixed on the canopy overhead, eyes narrowed as though lost in thought. He seemed content, yet every once in a while I caught him glancing at the perimeter of the clearing just as I had. That's the thing about forests, he said softly, not looking at me. You never know how alive they are until you stop and listen. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. The swirling sparks from the fire rose into the air, dying out before they could reach the dark boughs. In that moment, the hush enveloped us, broken only by faint voices from Greg and Mrs. Lawson by the stream. The forest creaked and groaned in the breeze, and I realized that yes, it did feel alive in a way I hadn't experienced before. Greg and Mrs. Lawson returned, their torch beams slicing through the gloom. She handed me one of the rinsed bowls. We're set for the night, she said. Might as well turn in soon. We've had a long day. We doused the fire to embers, ensuring it was safe. The world felt abruptly colder without its glow. My breath hung in the air like a ghostly wisp when I stood up. Shadows stretched across the clearing, merging with the thickening darkness among the trees. Far above, the sky shimmered with a wash of stars, brighter than I'd ever seen them, no streetlights to dull their shine. Bidding each other good night, we slipped into our respective tents. Greg and I unrolled our sleeping bags, exchanging tired jokes and remarks about random bruises from carrying gear. Outside, the forest chatter seemed to swell, the rustle of leaves, the chirp of night insects. I switched off my torch, letting my eyes adjust to the dark. Greg's silhouette was barely visible, shifting as he tried to get comfortable. Just before I drifted off, I heard a soft rustling sound right outside the tent. It could have been the wind, or a stray animal. My mind conjured up Mrs. Lawson's talk of ancient fairies and the Boaban Sith, the old legend swirling half-formed in my memory. I reminded myself not to be foolish. Plenty of mundane creatures roamed these woods. Still, for a brief moment, my pulse thrummed with nervous energy. I reached for my phone, intending to check the time. The screen wouldn't turn on. Dead battery. I let out a small sigh, forcing myself to relax. There was nothing to fear. Outside, a gentle breeze whispered through the pine needles, rocking me into a strange sense of both comfort and unease. Eventually, my eyelids grew heavy, and the hum of the forest carried me into a restless sleep. A soft chorus of birdsong pulled me from sleep. I blinked groggily, my breath catching in the cool morning air that seeped through the tent flap. Outside, the rising sun coaxed pale gold rays through the canopy, casting dancing shadows along the thin walls of our temporary shelter. Greg was already awake, yawning beside me. His hair stuck up in unruly tufts, and he rubbed his eyes as though he'd hardly slept at all. I pushed aside my sleeping bag and reached for my phone dead, as I'd discovered in the middle of the night. A faint prickle of unease passed through me, but I shoved it aside, chalking it up to the usual battery drain. Carefully, I unzipped the tent. Crisp air rushed in, carrying the smell of pine and damp earth. The clearing was bathed in delicate morning light, a mist clinging to the ferns at the edges. Mr. Lawson was already outside, rummaging through one of our plastic containers. I saw him lift a half-full bottle of water, shake it, then grunt in mild annoyance. "Morning, Sam," he called, glancing over as I emerged. "We're running low, so I'm popping down to the stream. Thought I'd fill up a couple of canteens." I nodded, my voice still thick with sleep. "Sure. I'll boil some water for tea when you're back." Greg stumbled out behind me, stretching until his spine cracked. "I'll boil the water. You can handle breakfast, Sam." Before I could reply, Mr. Lawson had hefted a large plastic jug and set off down the slope toward the burbling stream. I stood there, blinking in the fragile sunlight, the dew on the grass soaking into my socks. For a moment, everything felt peaceful, as if the tension of the previous night's rustling and uneasy thoughts had evaporated with the morning mist. Mrs. Lawson emerged from her tent a minute later, tying her hair into a loose ponytail. She offered a subdued smile. "Let's hope your father finds the water still good," she said to Greg, rubbing at her forearms to dispel the chill. "We want to have a nice cup of tea without worrying about contaminants." Greg, arching an eyebrow, merely shrugged. "It's a nature reserve, Mum. The water should be fine." She nodded, though a flicker of apprehension crossed her face. "Yes, of course." We set about tidying the camp, folding blankets, tucking away stray gear. Greg fiddled with the remains of the fire pit, prodding it with a stick. Occasionally, he glanced in the direction of the stream, as though he expected to hear his father clapping and laughing at the wonders of the wilderness. Instead, it was a dull hush of wind through branches that greeted us. The clearing felt strangely empty, the bird chatter less animated than I'd noticed upon waking. The morning sun was warm on my face, but goosebumps prickled my arms. It wasn't long before Mr. Lawson reappeared on the crest of the small slope. He strode back with the plastic jug in hand, his expression stormy. Despite the sun, he looked pale around the edges of his mouth. "What's wrong?" Mrs. Lawson asked, worry knitting her brow. Mr. Lawson set the jug on the grass with a heavy thud. He breathed out sharply, as though trying to compose himself. "The water's off," he said at last, dragging a hand through his hair. It's cloudy, almost muddy, and the smell, Christ, it's like sticking your nose in an old toolbox, metallic." Greg exchanged a troubled look with me. "Metallic?" "Yeah, like iron or rust," Mr. Lawson continued. "Yesterday, it was clear as glass. Now it's this disgusting, musty sludge." His cheeks flushed with frustration. "That's modern pollution for you," he growled. "Even in a nature park, it finds a way to destroy the land." He paced in a small circle, gesturing with his hands as if trying to dispel the anger. "I thought Galloway was protected, clean, pure." Mrs. Lawson stepped forward and laid a placating hand on his shoulder. "Brian, calm down. Maybe it's just runoff from upstream. Could be natural sediment or something from the higher. Remember the clouds that rolled in last night? Heavy rain somewhere else might have churned up the." He took a deep breath, clearly unconvinced. "Pollution or runoff, it's all the same in the end. Good thing we collected enough water yesterday, but we'll need more if we plan to stay." Mrs. Lawson squeezed his shoulder. "We're only a few miles from the official campsite. We can always hike back and refill if we have." Mr. Lawson shook his head, lips thinning in annoyance. Yes. Greg tried to lighten the mood. "Dad, we'll be fine. Worst case, we stretch what we have or head back." Mr. Lawson offered a reluctant nod, then turned to me. "Sorry for the rant, Sam. This was supposed to be a perfect getaway." I shrugged, mustering a small smile. "It's all right. Sometimes nature does what it wants." He grunted in agreement. Mrs. Lawson led him back to the tent to help organize breakfast, leaving Greg and me standing by the quiet remains of the fire pit. The chatter of birds had started again, but it felt distant, as if the forest had drawn a curtain around. "Guess we'll skip washing dishes in the stream," Greg said, attempting a wry grin. I nodded, glancing toward the faint trickle of water we could see in the distance. A vague sense of disquiet tugged at me. The forest's hush seemed heavier today, or perhaps I was just imagining. I told myself it was all in my head, no reason to get spooked by a bit of cloudy water, but I couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was on. Breakfast ended up being simple. Instant oatmeal and some leftover bread we toasted over a revived fire. Greg and I took charge of the pot, stirring the lumpy oats while Lawson sulked about the water's condition. Mrs. Lawson reassured him in gentle tones, suggesting we explore the trail further after we ate. A bit of wandering might lift his spirit. Once our meal was done, we doused the flames and scattered the ashes. It was just after 9 in the morning, the sun still climbing. Greg announced he was going to walk around the clearing, maybe see if there were any interesting plants or animals. I agreed to join him, figuring fresh air would do me good. Mrs. Lawson nodded approving. Mr. Lawson, calmer now, said he'd tidy up the tents and maybe check his phone's battery level, though we all suspected it would be futile. Greg and I drifted across the clearing, stepping carefully through knee-high ferns. Dewdrops clung to the fronds, sparkling in the sunlight. Below is an expanded, revised snippet from Chapter 3, capturing the mysterious young woman encounter. This version incorporates all the requested alterations, her comments about pollution and nature fighting back, her questioning the 5 months, and the narrator's intense fascination verging on enchantment. Written in the same James Herbert-inspired style, we meandered farther into the trees, lulled by the hush of morning. The mossy ground muffled our steps. Here, the pines gave way to a stand of old oak and birch, their branches arching overhead like vaulted ceilings in some ancient cathedral. Shafts of sunlight speared down through the leaves, illuminating the forest floor in bright islands, as if each sunlit patch promised safe harbor against the shadows stretching around us. Then we saw her. She stood a few feet away, partially concealed by a cluster of willows near a narrow, meandering path. At first, I wasn't sure she was real. She appeared so suddenly, as though the trees themselves had given birth to her slender form. Her hair was nearly white in the morning light. A soft cat touched it. Petite and delicate, she somehow emanated a quiet power, an intangible aura that drew my gaze and refused to let go. My heart thudded in my ears. I found myself rooted to the spot, unable to break eye contact. Greg, braver or perhaps just less transfixed, cleared his throat and stepped closer. "Hi," he managed, voice catching. "We didn't know anyone else was out here." A gentle smile lit her face. When she spoke, her voice was low and melodic, tinged with an accent I couldn't place as something old, rolling beneath the edges of her words. "I like to walk early," she said simply. "The mornings here are still so untouched." An odd hush hung over us, as though the forest itself held its breath to listen. I tried to speak, but my throat felt tight. She was strikingly beautiful in a way that defied any single era, as though she'd stepped out of a myth or a half-forgotten story. I'd guess she could be 17 or 30 and neither would have surprised me. My pulse fluttered at her every movement, caught between awe and some inexplicable longing. "I'm Sam," I finally managed, voice cracking. I felt my cheeks warm, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. "And this is Greg. We, camped back at the clearing." Her eyes drifted to Greg, then back to me. "A lovely spot," she said, calm and unblinking. "Though the stream, it seems less lovely this morning." Greg let out a short laugh, still shaking off his surprise. "You saw that too? It's all cloudy and metallic smelling now. Yesterday, it was clear as glass." She nodded, a small crease forming between her brows. "It's not just that the land is old. Factories, chemicals, they scar the land as though it's lifeless." Her gaze flicked in the direction of the murky water, eyes reflecting the sorrow of it. "But the earth breathes. It remembers. And sometimes, nature fights back in the only way it knows how." The finality in her tone sent a shiver up my spine. I glanced at Greg, who looked equally taken aback. Then she changed the subject with a slight tilt of her head, that gentle smile returning as if beckoning us to relax. "How long have you been here?" she asked. "You mentioned hiking in." Greg's expression regained a bit of its cockiness. "We hiked, about 5 miles from the main campsite. My dad insisted on something more remote." She arched an elegant eyebrow. 5 miles? She echoed softly, a lilting note of disbelief in her voice. Are you sure it was only 5? Her eyes flickered from Greg to me, as if sizing up whether we truly understood the place we'd entered. Distances in these woods don't always measure up to what you see on a map. The forest can shift. Greg let out a faint chuckle. Well, I'm pretty sure, though I won't argue if you say it felt longer. She smiled again, a subtle curve of her lips that struck me as both amused and faintly mysterious. Something fluttered in my chest, excitement, apprehension, or a disorienting mix of both. In that moment, it was as if the rest of the world receded, leaving only the three of us in a private cocoon of dappled light and whispered leaves. We spent what felt like an eternity talking with her, though it might have been only minutes. Stepping away from the willows, we drifted onto a patch of lush grass bright with morning sun, the dew glistening under our feet. She asked about our first night in Galloway, and Greg boasted about the real camping experience. No shower blocks, no electricity. Each time he tried to show off, she gave him a gentle, knowing smile, as though she saw right through his bravado. Meanwhile, I felt I was tumbling deeper under her spell. My every sense was heightened. Her soft, silvery laugh made my breath catch, and the tilt of her head sent a tingle across my skin. Her mere presence seemed to saturate the air with an electric hush. Part of me wanted to ask 1,000 questions: where she'd come from, how old she was, why she was out here alone, but none of them formed coherently in my throat. She spoke of Scottish legends in a way that made them sound like daily truths, not dusty folklore. There are old tales of fairies and Sith in these woods, she said, brushing her fingertips over a slender birch trunk. Some say they're mischievous, others warn they can be cruel. The forest has never forgotten them, nor have they forgotten the forest. Greg tried to smirk, but it faltered under her gaze. My mum says the same. I thought she was just messing with us, though. A flicker of amusement played across her features. Perhaps the old stories hold more truth than you realize. Sometimes our world and theirs overlap. She let her hand drop from the birch, turning to Greg with a teasing glint in her eye. So, be mindful of your steps. If a path seems shorter or longer than it ought to be, it might not be a path at all, but a doorway. Her voice faded to a hush, leaving a prickling sensation on my skin. I realized I hadn't moved from my spot. If anything, I'd been inching closer to her without meaning to. She smelled faintly of moss and wildflowers, a delicate scent that tugged at me more than any perfume could. My heart pounded in my ear. To ground myself, I offered her a small bottle of water, the good stuff we'd hauled in from yesterday. She accepted it, tilting it to her lips with an air of gratitude that felt almost real. Thank you, she murmured. Your kindness, well, it means more out here than you know. Greg cast me a quizzical look, but I couldn't meet his gaze. I was transfixed by the way she spoke, the subtle movement of her eyes and lips, the sense that she contained centuries of wisdom behind her youthful face. Everything she did seemed measured, deliberate. It was impossible to tear my thoughts away from her presence, from the quiet power she exuded. Eventually, the thought of returning to camp surfaced, though it felt like waking from a dream. Greg checked his watch, which was nearly dead, same as our phones, noting the time with mild surprise. We should head back, he said reluctantly. My dad and Mum will wonder where we got to. The girl's gaze lingered on us both, and I could have sworn her eyes sparkled with a faint sadness. Of course, she replied softly. You have your own path to follow. Greg thanked her for the conversation, and I managed a stammering goodbye. Before we left, curiosity bubbled in my chest, making me ask, will we see you? For a moment, she held my gaze, letting the question hang in the dappled morning light. Then her lips curved into a gentle, almost cryptic smile. Perhaps, she said, stepping back among the willows. if the forest wills it. With that, she slipped into the shadow of the branches, as though fading into the very essence of the wood. I stood there, breath tight, my mind whirling with the feel of her voice, her eyes, her otherworldly grace. Greg touched my arm lightly, snapping me from my reverie. We turned and made our way back toward our campsite, each of us caught in our own tangled thought. All the while, her words echoed in my mind. Distances in these woods don't always measure up. Sometimes nature fights back. It was a warning, or a promise, or maybe both. And as we pushed through the waist-high ferns, I couldn't shake the sense that I'd stepped over some invisible threshold, that this forest, ancient and bruised, might hold secrets I was never meant to see. Chapter 4. Distortions of Time. When Greg and I finally pushed through the tangles of undergrowth and saw the clearing again, a deep unease slithered beneath my ribs. I heard no rustle of leaves, no chatter of birds, only the faint rasp of my own breath echoing in my ears. It felt as though the forest had exhaled us back into our little campsite, disgorging us from its dark belly. And for the first time, I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to leave that place of shadow. The sun still hung low in the sky, glinting through the pines in a half-hearted drizzle of light. By all rights, it should have been midday at least, but the clearing looked caught in the same morning hush we'd left behind. There, near the remnants of the fire pit, stood Mr. and Miss Lawson, organizing our supplies with leisurely efficiency. My heart gave a jolt. If they appeared so calm, it meant we hadn't been gone long at all. Yet Greg and I had shared what felt like hours beyond the tree-line hours spent with. Greg halted beside me, his shoulders stiff. His eyes, wide with confusion, flicked from his parents to me, as if begging for an explanation I couldn't give. The scuff of my boot against damp moss startled me. Every sound felt magnified in this bizarre hush. Was time playing tricks on us? Mrs. Lawson looked up, a faint line creasing her forehead. "You two weren't gone long," she said, pulling a stray peg from the ground. "We're nearly finished here." "But we left ages ago," Greg said, his voice skirting the edge of panic. Mr. Lawson frowned, tossing a folded blanket into a rucksack. 15 minutes, maybe 20. Feels like you've only just left." Greg let out a hollow laugh that died the moment it slipped past his lips. My skin prickled, as though someone had scratched me with ice-cold fingernails. Could the forest have twisted our sense of time? Or had we just been so enraptured by that girl? I forced myself to speak, though my mouth felt drier than autumn
If this
leaves.
story kept you on the
We
edge of
must
your
have
seat,
lost track.
make sure to like and subscribe.
Mrs. Lawson studied
There's
my
a new
face,
tale waiting for you
concern
every
brightening
day.
her gray eyes. "You're both pale. Were you running around? Did something happen?" I resisted the urge to blurt out the truth, how the trees had swallowed us, how she had appeared and time had spun away like cotton thread, unraveling. Instead, I managed a weak shrug. "No, just looking around." Mr. Lawson let his gaze slide between us. "All right," he said eventually, though his tone held a note of doubt. "Either way, your mom and I need more water. You two have energy to spare. Want to come along or guard the fort?" He said it with a wan smile, but my stomach coiled in on itself. If we followed, we might miss the girl's return. I glanced at Greg, seeing the flicker of longing I felt mirrored in his eyes. We shook our heads in unison, claiming we needed to rest or keep an eye on the tents. Mrs. Lawson, perplexed, opened her mouth to say more. But Mr. Lawson touched her arm, and she yielded. With a final, uneasy look in our direction, they set off along the winding path back to the official campsite. Silence crept over the clearing, pressing on my ears like a heavy, invisible cloth. Greg stood rigid, fiddling with the hem of his jacket. He looked ready to jump out of his skin. I wasn't sure I was faring much better. My entire body thrummed with anticipation, every nerve on alert. Then she appeared again, as if conjured by our thought. One moment, the far edge of the clearing was empty. The next, She was standing there in a small patch of sunlight, a vision of pale hair and poised grace. My heart gave a fierce, disconcerting lurch. She wore the same faintly amused expression, like someone opening a door on friends they expected all along. "Hello again," she murmured, each syllable carrying that strange, lilting quality. "I wondered if you'd stay." A lump tightened in my throat. I managed a nod, while Greg shuffled forward, struggling to maintain an air of casual confidence. The sky overhead, though bright, offered no comfort, and the surrounding forest exuded a secretive hush. She drifted closer, graceful as a cat weaving through tall grass. "There's water enough, if you know where to look," she said, her gaze skimming over the half-burnt logs of our fire. "But that's not the reason you sent them away, is it?" Greg swallowed audibly, and I felt a knife-sharp spike of jealousy, or pride perhaps, both slice through me. Could she see how desperate we were for her attention? The thought both thrilled and unsettled me. "What do you mean?" Greg asked, voice thin. A tiny smile graced her lips. "Curiosity. You want to know who I am, why I'm here, and you want me to notice you." Her eyes flicked to me, stirring a painful knot beneath my rib. Yes, I wanted her attention too much, maybe. She stepped toward Greg and laid a hand on his shoulder, her fingertips just grazing the fabric of his jacket. Greg's breath hit. Then her other hand brushed my arm, a gentle sweep that left my skin tingling. A primal heat rippled through me, a surge of awareness that sparked one urgent question. Am I losing my mind? She must have sensed our turmoil, because she arched an eyebrow, regarding us both. "Why so tense? You're friends, aren't?" Greg almost stammered. We're best friends." "Then why glare at each other this way?" She withdrew her hands, leaving a dizzy emptiness in their wake. "You might tear each other apart if you aren't careful." My cheeks burned. Was it that obvious? I could feel Greg's apprehension radiating in the awkward distance between us. How has this girl turned us into rivals so quickly? "We're not glaring," I lied, the tremor in my voice betraying. She watched us in silence for an uncomfortably long moment, long enough for a faint breeze to rustle through the surrounding pines. The hush of the forest deepened, as though the entire place leaned in to listen. Then she let out a soft laugh, stepping back. "No matter. Shall we walk?" I hesitated, thinking of Mr. Lawson and Mrs. Lawson returning, possibly to find us vanished again. But the prospect of refusing her made my throat tight. Could I bear to let her slip away without learning more? The allure of her presence, the subtle wildness in her eyes, was a drug I craved again and again. Greg, likewise, seemed torn. He glanced at me, as if to confirm I felt the same pull, then squared his shoulders in a weak show of bravado. Her face brightened with a quiet triumph. She turned and beckoned us to follow, crossing the clearing in a measured stride. Each step she took seemed to dim the sunlight just a fraction, or perhaps it was my imagination. I tore my gaze from Greg's tense posture and fixed it on her slender form as we slipped beneath the jagged cathedral of branches. The sense of stepping into a hidden realm returned, stronger than ever. We left the open grass behind, soon swallowed by tangles of moss-draped trees that formed a looming canopy overhead. The path, if it could be called that, wound deeper into the forest where sunlight struggled to reach. My nerves began to hum with renewed urgency. Was time about to warp again? I thought of the morning's disorienting shift. What if? This time, we lost days instead of minutes. Greg cleared his throat beside me. I could feel his agitation, not just about the forest, but about the way my gaze kept flicking toward her. Was it possessiveness flaring in him, or in... I caught myself comparing the way she looked at Greg with how she looked at me. Petty instincts vying for her favor. Am I really this jealous? She led us in silence, her steps effortlessly light on the thick carpet of needles and decaying leaves. Now and then, she would glance over her shoulder, letting that small, enigmatic smile twist my inside. Each time I saw it, I felt a curious dread, as though part of me knew this all might end badly. But the rest of me was enthralled, starved for whatever mystical revelation she was about to offer. Who is she? I kept wondering. Is she just a clever drifter, or something more, something older than we dare imagine? An insect buzzed past my ear, making me flinch. The air smelled of moist bark and mold, and somewhere above, a crow let out a single hoarse call. I realized I was trembling, the tension coiled tight around my lungs. I caught Greg's eye again. His jaw was clenched, his brows furrowed with warring emotions. Fear, fascination, maybe a flicker of resentment. How far will we go for her? She must have sensed that question. Pausing in a glade of ancient oaks, she turned to us, half of her face in shadow. "Are you afraid?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. I swallowed, my throat painfully dry. Yes, I'm terrified. But the words stayed trapped behind my teeth. Greg opened his mouth but found no reply. We hovered between honesty and pride, uncertain how to proceed. She observed our indecision for a moment, then moved closer again. Close enough that I caught the faint scent of forest moss clinging to her skin. "Don't worry," she said, with a soft, almost predatory call. "I won't harm you." A pause, a flicker of a smile. "Unless you want me to." My heart battered my ribcage. Did I detect a teasing glimmer in her eyes? Or was that my own paranoia twisting her words? Beside me, Greg stiffened, and I wondered whether he'd step in, shield me, or claim her attention for himself. In that charged second, as the forest pressed in with its boundless shadows, I sensed our fragile camaraderie fracturing. Were we truly best friends? Or had we become two souls vying for the grace of an impossible girl? My thoughts spun with the memory of time slipping through our fingers, of the muddy water, of the lingering question, what if everything about this place is meant to entrap us? She reached out again, but this time, she did not touch me, or Greg's hand hovered just between us, palm up, as if offering a choice. "Shall we continue?" she asked quietly, her voice thrumming with an eerie invitation. For a beat, none of us moved. The wind seemed to hold its breath, the entire forest waiting on our answer. Greg shot me a glance, a silent plea. Should we turn back or follow her further? My pulse throbbed with a drumbeat of panic and desire. What if she never reappears if we leave now? Another piece of me whispered, what if we never escape if we keep going? Yet, I found myself nodding. So did Greg, our silent agreement driving us deeper into the green labyrinth. My insides twisted, torn between raw excitement and a dread that gnawed at the corners of my mind. God help us. We're following her again. The forest seemed to close in behind us, swallowing the path back to the clearing as though it had never been. Time, space, none of it felt consistent anymore. My heart hammered with every step. I could almost taste the tension in the air, a potent mix of intrigue and unease that pressed against my lungs, making each breath an effort. Still, neither Greg nor I turned back, and I sensed that she, whatever she was, relished every second of our fascination. Unknowable, ancient, as relentless as the tangled branches overhead, she drew us on, and we followed, helpless. As we followed the mysterious girl through the pines, the woods seemed to transform before our eyes. Gone were the twisted branches looming like skeletal arms. Instead, they arched overhead in graceful canopies, letting shafts of sunlight spill onto the soft moss underfoot. The air felt warm, heady, with the perfume of wildflowers and resinous pine sap. Birds flitted between branches, weaving an ethereal melody that prickled my skin. Greg trudged ahead of me, glancing over his shoulder now and then, the tension in his brow gradually unraveling. A lazy breeze stirred the leaves, releasing a heady mix of scent: honeysuckle, damp earth, fresh pine. I couldn't recall the woods ever smelling so alive. It was as if the entire forest exhaled contentment with every step she took. She glided before us on an unseen trail, trailing her fingertips along the trunks of venerable oaks. The leaves somehow greener than I remembered whispered secrets in her wake. A few times, I thought I glimpsed tiny specks of shimmering light dancing in the air. But whenever I blinked, they vanished. "Are you sure we're still in Galloway?" Greg asked, half jesting, but with a catch in his voice. "Doesn't feel like the same place." She cast him a playful glance. "Forest can change in the blink of an eye," she said, her voice laced with a hypnotic undertone. "Especially when they decide to welcome you." Greg shrugged in mild confusion. I watched him, part of me envious of how he could still crack a joke, another part sympathizing because my own thoughts were trapped between wonder and disbelief. As for me, I found myself drinking in every detail of her. The way that pale gold hair swayed at her shoulders, how her subdued laughter, a mere breath, ignited a strange excitement in my chest. Soon the ground sloped gently downward, and the smell of water cut through the floral richness. We arrived at a small stream, sunbeams dancing off its glassy surface. Unlike the metallic reek we'd tasted near our camp, this water ran clear as polished crystal. Algae-clad rocks gleamed beneath the flow, and tiny silver fish zipped through pools of light. She paused at the bank, turning to us with a delighted smile. "Drink," she said softly, almost as if granting a blessing, "if you're thirsty." Greg and I exchanged quick glances, curiosity warring with caution. The memory of that tainted stream hung in the backs of our minds. Reading our hesitance, she crouched at the water's edge, sunlight forming a halo around her slight form. With fluid elegance, she cupped her hands and scooped a clear pool of water. For a moment, time slowed, each droplet lingering on her slender fingers, shimmering like liquid jewel. Then, almost erotically, she lifted her hands to her mouth, letting the water trickle past her lips in a slow, deliberate cascade. I couldn't tear my gaze away. One rivulet escaped the corner of her lips, catching the sun before dripping back into the stream. The sight made my heart quake, warmth radiating in my chest. Next to me, Greg let out a short, almost involuntary gasp. She finished with a sigh of satisfaction, droplets clinging to her chin. "It's safe," she whispered, an invitation laced with challenge. Neither Greg nor I could resist. We dropped to our knees, ignoring how foolish we might have looked. I plunged my hands in first, and the icy shock lanced through my arm. Greg did the same, scooping a generous handful. Lifting the water to my lips, I drank. It was like tasting living light, pure, chill, bursting with clarity. My whole body hummed with renewed vitality. Greg made a sound of raw astonishment, gulping down more. I felt it too, a tingling rush that coursed through my veins, as though every cell thrummed with hidden power. My eyes fell shut under the intensity of it. How could simple water taste so rich, so alive? When we finally lifted our heads, the girl was watching us with a measured amusement. "Better than anything from your towns, isn't it?" she murmured. All I could do was nod dumbly. Greg, for once, was speechless. She observed us for a breath longer, then her eyes gleamed with some quiet thought. "You've shared my stream. I suppose it's time you knew my name." Greg inhaled. "Yes, please." She flicked her pale hair over one shoulder. "It's Callie. That's all, just Callie." Greg ventured a hesitant smile, still awed by the aftertaste of the water's chill. "Short for anything?" Callie shook her head. "No, it simply means from the forest, in a sense. Names have power." Greg tried to nod as though he understood. As for me, my thoughts still swirled with the lingering effect of that water, me muscles loose yet energized, my senses heightened. The name echoed in my mind, stamping itself into my consciousness with an almost physical jolt. From there, the rest of the day unfurled in a haze of magic. We strolled deeper among the trees, letting Callie guide us as though the forest parted paths just for. Birdsong rose and fell in a lilting chorus overhead. Dappled sunlight warmed the soft moss, and the breeze was balmy enough that none of us felt the need to hurry. She asked about our hopes and dreams, things we'd never dared utter aloud, yet her serene presence coaxed them from us as easily as drawing water from a spring. Greg and I bickered off and on, each craving Callie's undivided attention. Once or twice, I caught the jealousy shining in his eyes when she laughed at one of my offhand jokes. At other times, I felt a twisted knot in my own gut whenever she smiled at him more widely. Somehow, she managed to soothe those undercurrents of tension with gentle words, as if reminding us the forest was vast enough for all our ambition. When I tried to ask about her, where she'd come from, why she lived among these trees, her replies formed a tapestry of half-told stories. Glimpses of ancient pathways, old songs whispered by hidden spirits, and archaic rites performed under the full moon. Yet every concrete detail slipped from my grasp moments after she spoke it, as if the forest itself refused to let me hold such secrets. The afternoon sun began to tilt, painting the world in dusky gold. Greg cleared his throat, glancing at the shadows lengthening around us. "We should get back," he said, his voice dull with reluctant acceptance. A sting of annoyance cut through my chest. How could he think about leaving so soon? Didn't he feel the same enchantment I did? But Callie turned, reading the conflict etched across our faces. "Perhaps that would be wise," she agreed quietly. "Your families might worry. I'll walk with you." My protest caught in my throat. For all my yearning to stay, I knew we couldn't vanish into these woods forever. Could we? Greg sensed my agitation, giving me a brief, questioning look that I stubbornly ignored. Callie led us along a circuitous path, the forest gradually shedding its dreamlike quality. It was subtle at first. The birdsong grew less melodic, the fragrance of wildflowers no longer pressed in so sweetly. The tang of pine remained, but with a more ordinary edge. Sunbeams still pierced the canopy, yet their glow felt muted, cooler. Eventually, we came upon a familiar clearing. Our tents were visible in the distance, Mr. Lawson's voice carrying on the evening breeze as he rummaged among supplies. My chest clenched in sudden dread at the thought of stepping back into mundane reality. "This is where I leave you," Callie said softly. She fixed me with a lingering glance, something bright yet melancholy in her eyes. Greg, too, shuffled in silent discomfort, as if part of him wanted to beg her to stay. She only smiled, that gentle tilt of her lips evoking a million unspoken promises. I managed a faint "thank you," while Greg murmured a similar sentiment. And then, before either of us could voice another word, she turned and slipped into the foliage. It was as though the forest swallowed her without so much as a crack of twig or rustle of leaf. Greg exhaled in a shaky rush, the tension in his shoulders returning now that Callie was gone. I stood rooted to the spot, the day's strangeness ticking in my veins like a slow, bewitching pulse. It was unbearable to think we might never see her again. At last, with the sky deepening to a tender blue, we trudged back to camp. Every step felt heavier, the forest's enchanting presence diminished. Our senses seemed dulled in Callie's absence, as though we'd emerged from some other world. And as the silhouetted tents loomed nearer, one thought rang painfully clear. Callie. A name like soft wind in the pines, or a secret lost in the hush. She'd left her mark on us, and I wasn't sure if we would ever be the same. The air in the clearing felt wrong as Greg and I approached. The sky had dimmed from the warm hues of late afternoon into a drab, purplish dusk, painting the forest shadows even darker. The pines loomed like silent monoliths around the makeshift camp. I couldn't shake the sensation that the place itself was watching us, listening for our footfalls, waiting for us to speak. A few yards ahead, Mr. and Mrs. Lawson stood by the tents, their faces caught in the last thin rays of daylight. But something about their expressions made my stomach lurch. I expected annoyance, maybe exhaustion after all, We'd been gone for hours, or at least it felt that way. Instead, they looked frightened, confused, afraid. Mrs. Lawson clutched a crumpled map, her knuckles white against the worn paper, while Mr. Lawson rubbed his brow as though trying to dispel a lingering nightmare. Greg slowed his pace, shooting me a wary glance. "They don't look right," he whispered, voice hushed as if he feared breaking a spell. I nodded, my own pulse beating hard in my neck. With every step, the forest's hush closed in around us, a heavy silence that pressed against my eardrums. I couldn't hear birds anymore. No rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. Even the wind seemed to have stilled, letting the dark pines stretch overhead like bony arms. Finally, we reached Mr. and Mrs. Lawson. By now, the shadows draped their features in lines of fatigue, but it was the wide, startled look in their eyes that truly unnerved me. Mrs. Lawson swallowed hard, face pale as a ghost, while Mr. Lawson stared at us with a desperate frustration. Greg cleared his throat. "Mom, Dad, did something happen?" he asked softly, as though too loud a question might shatter them. Mr. Lawson barked a bitter laugh, the sound hollow in the twilight. "Something happened? We couldn't find the bloody campsite, that's what. We walked for hours." He trailed off, his voice shaking under the weight of unsaid fears. The water containers at his feet were obviously empty as a bone. There wasn't even a single bead of condensation on the plastic. Mrs. Lawson looked down at the map she gripped, then back at Greg and me, her eyes glimmering with a frantic need for reassurance. "We set off right after you two left," she began, voice trembling. "Had a good sense of direction. The forest signs pointed to the official camp no more than 3 miles from here, but we never got there. It's like the path shifted. I felt an icy wave trickle down my spine. Paths can change," Callie had said, in that gentle, knowing tone. What if she'd been speaking the literal truth? Greg forced a smile, but the effort looked painful on his face. "Maybe you two got turned around. It happens in big forests." "You." "That's what I thought at first." Mr. Lawson cut in, an angry flush creeping up his neck. He jabbed a finger at the map, which fluttered in Mrs. Lawson's hand. "But we tried 3 times, Greg. 3. Each time we followed the marked routes. See here and here." He tapped a faint dotted line that, in the gathering gloom, looked like a broken life. "And every time, we ended up back here. Right back in this damned clearing." He exhaled, shoulders sagging with defeat. I can't get my head around it. Are we going in circles, or is the forest playing tricks on us? An uncomfortable chill clamped around my lungs. My gaze slid to the tree line, where the shadows had grown thick as tar. Could the forest truly be conspiring to trap us? That felt insane, yet the look on Miss Lawson's face made me wonder if it was the only explanation. She crushed the map against her chest, as though pressing it close might reveal some hidden truth. "We must have circled around," she murmured, trying to convince herself more than anyone else. But it didn't feel like that. Each turn seemed new, each path fresh. But it brought us here, and now it's nearly dark. Greg tried to soothe them with a confident nod. "Don't worry," he said, inhaling a shaky breath. Mrs. Lawson's head jerked up at that. A flicker of alarm lit her pale eyes. "Callie? Who is Callie?" Mr. Lawson's gaze snapped between us. "Yes, who's this now?" he demanded. "Another camp?" I glanced at Greg, uncertain how to begin. He shifted from foot to foot, then told them everything: how we'd encountered the forest girl, how we'd spent the afternoon with her by a crystal-clear stream that seemed worlds away from here. My chest fluttered when he spoke her name aloud. Callie, and I half expected some echo from the forest, but none came. The hush was absolute, oppressive. By the time we finished, Mrs. Lawson pressed the back of her free hand to her lips, eyes glittering with both fascination and dread. "Callie," she repeated, barely above a whisper, from the forest. Mr. Lawson frowned, his frustration mounting. From the forest? And why haven't we seen this girl? If she knows her way around, why didn't she come talk to us? We're the adults here, after all. Greg rubbed the back of his neck, uncertain. She doesn't seem concerned about grown-ups, he said quietly. It's almost like she only appears to me and Sam. I don't know why. That's ridiculous, Mr. Lawson snapped, scowling. She can't just pick and choose who sees her. People aren't invisible, for God's sake. She's playing some trick, or you two are. Greg stiffened. Dad, I swear this is real. Sam's seen her too. He gestured at me for backup. I nodded, a desperate knot tightening in my throat. She guided us, I said. Told us about the forest. Gave us water from a stream that was different. It tasted unreal. Like something out of a fairy tale. My words sounded foolish even to my own ears, but I couldn't find a better way to describe it. Mrs. Lawson's lips parted, and for a moment it seemed like she wanted to say more but couldn't form the words. A trembling hush settled over the group, broken only by the rustling of a few leaves. From high above, the sky had dimmed to a purplish bruise, the promise of night creeping in. An involuntary shiver racked my body. Finally, she found her voice. Callie, she whispered, staring at the ground. That name means, from the forest. In Old Scots. An old legend. My grandmother once told me stories of woodland spirits with names like that. Kayich or Kali, or something in between. What are you mumbling, woman? Mr. Lawson hissed, impatience jolting through him. He hated talk of folklore ghosts, and spirits rattled him more than he'd ever admit. How's that help us get out of here? She lowered the map, eyes distant. It doesn't, she murmured, pressing her lips into a tight line. Then more urgently, why doesn't this girl come talk to us? Why doesn't she help us find our way back? If she can guide you two, she can show us all. Greg's breath shook. I don't know, he admitted. We haven't asked that yet, but tomorrow. Tomorrow? Mr. Lawson snarled. You expect us to spend another night here? He raked a hand through his hair, and in the gloom, he looked like a man on the verge of madness. We're nearly out of supplies. The water we have is nearly gone because we thought we'd reached the bloody campsite, and the stream here is still foul. How many days do you think we can last if we keep going in circles? A thick silence descended. My heart hammered. Could the forest really trap us? Could it be that we'd starve or dehydrate in a place so ironically full of trees and undergrowth? The very thought made my skin crawl. I remembered the crystalline waters that Callie had shown us. How sweet and invigorating it tasted. But would she lead us back there? Dad, Greg tried to say, voice shaking slightly. It'll be okay. We'll ask her tomorrow. She promised to show us more. I swallowed hard. Yes, she said the forest can shift. Maybe we need her to navigate it. But even as I spoke, my words sounded horrifying, like an admission that we needed this strange girl to save us from a land that should have been as straightforward as a map. Mrs. Lawson gazed at me, her eyes haunted by unspoken questions. I sensed she wanted to demand more. What is this girl's motive? Why does she seem so elusive to the rest of us? But fear tightened her throat, and she said nothing. Mr. Lawson shook his head with a gruff sigh, turning away from us. He stomped to the edge of the clearing, scanning the darkening tree line. We'll set out at first light, he muttered, fists clenched. If your forest friend wants to show us the way, so be it. Otherwise, I'm taking charge. I won't be made a fool by a bunch of trees and he stopped short, either unable to say more or refusing to let fear shape his words. Night descended quickly, the pines overhead forming a ragged curtain that shut out even the faintest glimmer of stars. Cold settled in, clinging to our clothes, burrowing under our skin. We had just enough water left to share a meager ration, wetting our throats before Mr. Lawson told us to douse the fire we'd managed to spark, to conserve fuel. The camp felt naked and vulnerable, like a lone raft drifting in a sea of black. As I crawled into the tent I shared with Greg, 1,000 questions battered my mind. How could two adults fail to find a simple campsite? Why did the forest keep leading them back here? Was there something unnatural at play? More than anything, the memory of Callie's calm smile taunted me. Would she come at dawn, gliding through the pines, carrying her otherworldly reassurance? Or were Greg and I just pawns in a cruel woodland game we didn't understand? I tossed on my sleeping bag, listening to Mr. Lawson muttering outside as he tried to calm Mrs. Lawson's nerves. Their whispered voices bled through the tent wall in brittle fragments. I caught phrases like, strange girl, no sense of direction, cursed place. I wanted to close my ears, block it all out, but that creeping dread had already sunk its hooks into me. Sleep was a long time coming. Every snap of a twig made my skin prickle. The wind picked up, and for the briefest moment I thought I heard gentle laughter brushing the edge of the trees. A feminine chuckle, so soft it could have been a trick of my imagination. Could it be her, Callie? My heart thudded at the possibility. Still, the forest gave no answer, and the tent's interior loomed dark and stifling around me. I knew morning would bring fresh tensions, fresh questions, maybe even fresh horrors. And amid it all, we'd cling to the hope that Callie would somehow guide us from this living labyrinth before it devoured us whole. Despite my exhaustion, sleep wouldn't come. Greg lay next to me, breathing shallow, face turned toward the tent wall. Every so often, I caught him flinching at the faintest rustle of leaves outside. I couldn't blame him. My own pulse thrummed in my ears, a constant reminder that something was deeply wrong here. A single image filled my mind, Callie's serene smile, and the way she'd vanish without a trace. Earlier, that had enthralled me. Now it felt like a threat. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, I sat bolt upright, heart hammering. A distant scream curled through the trees, a sharp, keening wail that set my blood to ice. Greg jolted awake beside me. We fumbled for our torches, exchanging a panicked look. "What the hell was that?" Greg whispered, voice trembling. I had no words. My mouth felt coated in sand. Outside, I heard agitated voices, Mr. Lawson yelling something, Mrs. Lawson's tone rising in frantic response. Another scream tore through the clearing. This time, it wasn't distant at all. It was right outside. Greg ripped open the tent zip, and we spilled into the crisp night air. The clearing looked surreal, lit only by the flicker of a dying lantern propped on a rock. Mrs. Lawson stood near the edge of the trees, hands clenched at her chest. She was trembling violently, eyes wide with unimaginable terror. Mr. Lawson hovered behind her, face caught between anger and confusion. The tendons in his neck bulged as he tried to steady her. "For God's sake, Claire, calm down." But Mrs. Lawson couldn't. She pointed at the tree line, her voice no more than a strangled whisper. I saw her. A cold sweat prickled my skin. "Her?" I asked, though I knew who she meant. Mrs. Lawson's gaze snapped to me. In the jittering lantern glow, I saw tears gleaming on her cheeks. That girl Callie. But it wasn't just a girl, she managed, voice cracking. Her face changed. Her eyes were different, glowing like an animal's. And her mouth. She trailed off, shuddering. Greg swallowed. "Mum." "She's a Bobhan Sith," Mrs. Lawson spat out, trembling from head to toe. "You hear me? A Bobhan Sith." Mr. Lawson hissed at her. "Stop with that nonsense. You'll terrify the kids." They need to be terrified. Mrs. Lawson cried, eyes wild. This isn't a fairy tale. It's real. She's a vampire, Brian. A creature that lures young men and feasts on their blood. That's what the legends say. Greg's face went ashen. Mum, no. Callie's not like that. She's... Mrs. Lawson whirled on him, voice raw. Did you see her at night, Gregory? This night? Because I did. For a split second her shape shifted, her teeth. She sucked in a rattling breath, clutching at Mr. Lawson's sleeve. I'm telling you, she's a Bobhan Sith. I felt my stomach lurch, recalling how easily Callie entranced us, how she guided us to an impossibly pure stream. Could that have been part of the lure? My mind rebelled against the thought, yet Mrs. Lawson's raw panic seemed too genuine to dismiss. Mr. Lawson's hand hovered near his wife's shoulder, half in comfort, half in disbelief. All right, he growled. Enough. Let's say you're right, she's something unnatural. We're leaving. Now. Mrs. Lawson nodded rapidly, tears still streaking her face, as though his agreement was the only reassurance in the world. Greg grabbed my arm, eyes brimming with dread and confusion. Sam, he muttered, Dad's got a point. We can't stay here. I swallowed the lump in my throat. My heart thundered, the memory of Callie's mesmerizing beauty colliding with Mrs. Lawson's vision of a monstrous face. Had we been dancing at the edge of a predator's claws all along? Mr. Lawson stomped across the clearing, collecting anything he could in a flurry of panic. A half-burned torch, a single water bottle, the shredded map. He flung them into a rucksack with trembling hands. We'll hike the 5 miles to the main campsite. I don't give a damn if it's dark. We can't stay here, waiting to be... His voice fractured on the last word. The idea of that gentle stream, the wide-eyed forest silence, turning into a lethal trap made my blood run cold. Hunted, the forest gorilla, Bobhan Sith. My head spun. Greg and I tore down our tent in record time, not caring how we crammed it into the pack. Mrs. Lawson's face remained pinched with fear, her gaze snapping from tree to tree, as though expecting Kaliith Bobhan Sitto leap out and tear our throats open. My own panic soared, the small hairs at the back of my neck tingling whenever I glanced at the darkened pine. Mr. Lawson hoisted the largest rucksack onto his back. Let's move. Stay close. No wandering off. We set off in a ragged column, Greg and me in the middle, Mr. Lawson leading, Mrs. Lawson clinging to the rear. The clearing vanished behind us in moments, swallowed by a labyrinth of trunks and branches. The lantern's feeble glow wavered with every step, hurling wild shadows across the roots and undergrowth. The forest itself seemed alive, no longer the welcoming tapestry of green we'd explored earlier. Twisted shapes jutted from the gloom-exposed roots, tumbled logs, all contorted like petrified snakes. The scent of pine was sharper, almost acrid, as though the trees exhaled warning after warning. And in the blackness overhead, I glimpsed tattered ribbons of moonlight, too frail to guide us. Behind us, a low moan or a distant wail chode through the pines. We froze, hearts pounding, breath steaming in the chill air. Mr. Lawson swung the lantern, revealing nothing but a shifting mass of leaves. Yet the noise repeated, caught somewhere between an animal's cry and a woman's. Mrs. Lawson let out a tiny whimper. We have to keep going. We pressed on, forcing our feet to shuffle faster over the uneven ground. My lungs burned with each gulp of cold air, sweat chilling on my back. Greg tripped over a knotted root at one point, sprawling forward with a curse. Mrs. Lawson helped him up, tears streaking her face when she realized how scraped his palm was. Even Mr. Lawson paused, muttering a strained apology for pushing us so hard. But fear drove him on, and none of us dared linger. Shadows jumped and shrank with the lantern's swing, forming phantoms in the corners of our vision. Each time, I thought I saw a slender figure slip between the trunks, or a glimpse of pale gold hair flicker in the dark, My heart slammed into my rib. I told myself it was just the imagination, shaped by terror. But a small, persistent voice whispered, "She's watching you." The trail felt endless, the slope steeper than we remembered. Our boots sloshed in unseen puddles, and I stumbled more than once, expecting each time to feel her hand close around my ankle. But the forest gave no solid sign of pursuit, only relentless, suffocating dread. Somewhere along the way, Mrs. Lawson's panic erupted into quiet sobs. "Brian," she hissed at Mr. Lawson, "we're lost again. We should have seen some sign by now. A marker, a trail some." Mr. Lawson shot back a desperate look. "We keep going. We must." His voice shook with raw fear and determination in equal measure. "I won't let her trap us like animals." Greg and I exchanged a quick glance, each panting for breath. At the mention of her, the air around us seemed to thicken. Suddenly, a familiar cry shattered the silency, hair-raising wail that tore through the pines, close enough that I felt the vibrations in my chest. Greg grabbed my arm, nails digging through my jacket sleeve. Mrs. Lawson nearly dropped the lantern. Then, as if in answer, a sickening hush choked the forest. No wind, no scurrying creatures, not even our footfalls seemed to dare break it. My ears rang with the memory of that unholy sound. I pictured Callie's face morphing, fangs bared, eyes glowing with ravenous intent, just as Mrs. Lawson had claimed to see. My stomach twisted in revulsion and disbelief. "We have to run," Mr. Lawson croaked, voice strained to the edge of sanity. "All of you now." He started first, lurching ahead at a stumbling sprint, the lantern bobbing in his grip like a crazed firefly. We tore after him, adrenaline surging despite our exhaustion. Limbs burned. Breath came in ragged gasps. Yet the primal terror of being overtaken spurred us into a chaotic dash. Trees whipped past, branches clawed at our sleeves like skeletal fingers. My vision blurred with sweat and tears. The world reduced to lurching shadows and the frantic glow of the lantern. At some point, Greg tripped again, nearly bringing me down with him. I yanked him upright, ignoring the jolt of pain in my wrist. "Miss," Lawson cried out behind no words, just a desperate exhalation. Mr. Lawson's curses rang out intermittently, lost in the pounding of our blood. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The undergrowth snagged our ankles, the path to safety an endless twisting corridor of black. I felt the weight of the forest pressing in, as if 1,000 unseen eyes peered through the gloom, mocking our frantic struggle. Then light not the feeble flame of the lantern, but a dull orange glow through the trees. A lamppost, or maybe the visitor center's outer security. Whatever it was, the moment I caught sight of that faint illumination, a sob of relief burst from my throat. Mr. Lawson gasped something incoherent and forced his exhausted legs to pump faster. We staggered out of the tree line and stumbled onto rough gravel. A small car park lay ahead, dotted with a few vehicles under flickering yellow lamps. Though the scene was far from welcoming a battered sign, a closed ranger booth, it might as well have been salvation. We collapsed in a panting, trembling heap beside the first car we found, not ours, but we hardly cared. The night sky overhead felt broader, less suffocating. Mrs. Lawson slumped against Mr. Lawson, shaking from head to toe. Greg practically collapsed into me, breath rasping in his throat. No one spoke for several agonized seconds. My ears rang, and my lungs felt on fire. Eventually, Mr. Lawson found his voice. "We made it," he croaked. "Thank God." He fumbled for his phone, trembling hands flipping it open. Even if there was no signal, the dull glow of the screen felt like a victory against the all-consuming darkness behind. Somehow, we'd escaped. For now. The forest stood at our backs, a looming wall of shadows that refused to yield its secrets, or the creature we'd left behind. I peered into that blackness, heart still racing. Was she out there, watching us, disappointed we'd fled her grasp? The memory of her half-smile twisted in my gut. A wave of nausea and regret washed over Merigret, that the enchantment I once felt had turned to raw terror. And a deeper regret that, in some corner of my mind, I still longed to see her again. But that, I realized grimly, was the Bobhan Sith's power. The lure. Even now, breathing the relative safety of civilization, a part of me couldn't entirely banish the magnetic pull of her presence. We might have escaped with our lives, but the forest and the woman who dwelled there had left its mark on our soul. No one moved for a long moment, each of us locked in our own trembling thoughts. Then Mr. Lawson forced himself upright, pulling Mrs. Lawson with him. "We'll drive," he whispered hoarsely, voice laced with fragile triumph, "straight to the nearest town. And tomorrow, we'll figure out what the hell to do next." No one argued. None of us could. We just stumbled toward the nearest unlocked car thankfully, our own, and flung ourselves inside, slamming doors as though the Bobhan Sith might crash through them at any instant. Only then, as the engine sputtered into life and the headlights cut twin beams through the gloom, did the forest recede behind us. Yet even as we pulled away, my heart pounded with the certainty that we had not truly escaped. The image of her pale, hypnotic, and infinitely dangerous lingered in every shadow, in every breath of wind against the window. The Bobhan Sith had revealed herself, and somewhere in the depths of Galloway's ancient woods, she waited still. Epilogue. Back in the world of streetlights and dull, orderly routines, the events in Galloway Forest feel half-remembered, like a fever dream that leaves only a film of sweat and a lingering sense of dread. Lawson has made his peace with it, though you might call it willful denial. He insists we stumbled across local kids who decided to spook us country pranksters, he says, taking advantage of our city's slicker ignorance. We panicked, he tells anyone who asks. Lost our heads. Could happen to anyone. And yet, when you press him ask why he tore down an entire campsite in the middle of the night, this face colors, and he changes the subject. Mrs. Lawson is more guarded. She never quite meets your eyes anymore, and her once quiet warmth has hardened into a polite hush. Whenever someone mentions the trip, she tenses, mutters that some things are best left alone, and goes about her day with a worried crease in her brow. You see it in the way she locks the windows at dusk, or how her hands tighten around a shopping basket when a shadow flits by. The memory hovers over her like a ghost she refuses to name. Greg and Ewell, we've drifted apart since that night. We tried to keep in touch at first, bounding between half-truths and forced laughter, but we've grown older, and the fractures run deep. He still talks about going back, though. He even calls sometimes, late at night, breath thick with a dreamer's conviction. I know Callie's there, he said. We owe it to ourselves to find out what really happened. He's bold, or naive, and maybe bold. I'd be lying if I claimed the idea doesn't churn in my mind. She's lodged in there like a splinter I can't extract. Part of me wants to believe Callie was just some odd, free-spirited girlone of those wandering hippies who found a hidden stream and a heady sense of nature's power. But there's another part, a darker part, that recalls the way the forest seemed to bend around her, the way my senses flared whenever she drew near, as if she whispered in my blood. Sometimes I lie awake at night, the memory of her pale gold hair shimmering in the sun, those eyes that seemed carved from twilight. The craving to see her again is like an itch in my very bones, a subtle, gnawing obsession. And yet, there's a twist in my gut when I remember Mrs. Lawson's white face, her whispered claim that Callie was something far older, something that feeds on human longing. Greg might return to Galloway Forest, but if I ever go back, I won't go with him. I can't stand the thought of us fighting again over her attention. Maybe I resent him because he wants her tour, because I know, deep down, neither of us is strong enough to face whatever she truly is. Still, the pull remains. The old rhythms of daily life can't erase the hum of that ancient green, or the lingering taste of that impossibly pure stream on my tongue. If Callie is out there, whether mortal or a creature of the night, she's claimed part of me, taken my soul, perhaps. One day, I'll return to find her, to discover once and for all if she's flesh and blood or a nightmare in human form. And when I do, I'll either conquer the enchantment or surrender to it entirely.